Hey, get Brocked here. Here's another ship guy for you since these are somewhat popular. Today, everyone's favorite, turret placement. What makes for good turret placement? Different schools of thought on turret placement. What makes for bad for turret placement? How about a drinking game for every time I say turret placement? Some context before I start. Remember, Space Engineers is a sandbox. You can do whatever you want with it. That being said, because there are no rules for it, and it's essentially space Legos, we like to impose our own rules to make things satisfying, fun, whatever, right? Part of engineering is designing something efficiently, and in order to design something efficiently, you need a metric for that, right? Over-engineering is not always a good term. So, as you might know if you're familiar with my series, we have a balance system for the PvP. You can see my ship class guide over here. Here's also a link for my previous videos on ship guides. They might give you some context from where I'm coming from here. We use Assault Weapons Pack as well. That is our weapons mod, and it gives us a good balance of light and capital grade weapons, and also stays within the vanilla vision of Space Engineers, that World War II kinetic weapon kind of feel. Each ship also has specific weapon limitations, right? A cruiser can have only so many weapons, destroyers can only have light weapons, capital ships can have these types of weapons, so on and so forth. Not going to get into it, but you get the idea. They also have armor limitations, or they can have armor, only belt armor, CICs, whatever, you get the point. So yeah, this obviously makes sense within a meta. I know people are going to get upset because they're like, well, my ship's obviously better, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but we have limitations, right? We can't just build infinite turrets, whatever, right? So this entire conversation is within the context of what makes sense within our sandbox and our rule set, right? Okay, moving on. I'll also be using the words secondary and primary weapons a lot. For some that don't understand it, I think most people get it. But regardless, when the Dreadnought Revolution came around, ships kind of went from just having a lot of weapons to having a clear distinction between secondary and primary fire, right? So when battleships became the modern way we imagine battleships, they had these massive main batteries, so like the Iowa 16-inch guns, or the more modest, like 8-inch guns on something like a county-class heavy cruiser. The main battery is the purpose of that warship. The warship was designed around the main battery, at least cruisers and up, and it's designed to take advantage of those weapon systems, right? It's kind of like the meme of the A-10, the plane was built around the gun. Yeah, so in this case, ships are designed around their main battery and making their main battery work, right? Sometimes you have it in reverse, but this was less common. It's also interestingly in what makes ships obsolete, right? Once your gun can no longer penetrate your adversary, because armor is also evolving at a similar rate, your ship is obsolete and generally gets sent to the scrapyard or transferred to different roles. Secondary guns are the other guns that aren't the primary weapons, and your ship isn't designed around them. They're designed to either do a specific thing, like star shells, or anti-aircraft, or just fill in gaps of your primary weapons, right? A lot of battleships actually have very awkward firing arcs when you get really close. Fun examples, Taffy 3, destroyers slipped in within the firing arc. I believe it was Taffy 3. Slipped within the firing arc of some battleships, and the guns couldn't depress far enough. Happened a lot in the Pacific. So your secondary guns can take care of this, right? In Space Engineers, the context is generally you have faster firing weapons to deal with smaller ships, and your big capital weapons to deal with bigger ships. More on that in a bit. My series, finally, to get this intro out of the way, we have 200mm and 150mm missile launchers, 43mm and 20mm like point defense anti-air, and that makes up our light weapons or our secondary weapons, depending on your class. These have 2,000 meter auto range. That is, the turret can do its thing up to 2,000 meters. Our heavy weapons, we have 400mm, and these things called FOB 1000 and FOB 1500s. These are just axial guns, kind of slow max. And these are considered our heavy or main battery weapon. The projectiles can actually go up to, I believe, 18 kilometers, but the turret itself can only auto range out to about 2,000. This gives heavy emphasis on actually slaving your turrets on battleships to make use of that long projectile range. More on that in a bit. Okay, now that I've talked your ear off, it's time to actually talk about the reason for this video. Where do you put the turrets? We gotta start with the gun brick. The gun brick is an example of what not to do if you're operating on a budget or, you have constraints. These obviously only work in zero limitation, zero size restraints, unlimited budget, whatever you want to call it, designs, right? It's also worth noting the reason why these don't work in real life, right? Because we model our designs after real life, is because there are no reload mechanisms in Space Engineers, or at least the conveyor system takes up near zero space. In the real world, the turret itself is kind of like the tip of the iceberg. The entire carousel, magazine, the entire system that supports the turret takes up a huge amount of space. Thus, you can't just stick turrets on every conceivable point of the ship. So why exactly is this bad? I think most people can imagine it, but it's an issue of economy of guns or firepower and poor firing arcs. The first, and kind of the second gets into it too, refers to how many guns you need to do the gun thing, the shooty thing. When a target presents itself to you, you have to engage it, right? And while a gun brick can bring a lot of guns to bear, percentage-wise, you're actually bringing very little to bear because of poor designing, right, and flat surfaces, tons of guns, poor firing arcs. You can only bring a certain percentage of guns to bear at a time. Worst case scenario, if you have like a literal Borg cube with guns on a flat surface, you're only getting maybe 40% on a really good day on target at a time. One plane, maybe one plane and a half, two planes at best, and that's about 40%. That's obviously bad, right? You don't want half of your firepower doing absolutely nothing. Not only is your design horribly inefficient, but it means if your universe has any kind of parity, a slightly better designed ship that has concentrated firepower and good firing arcs can outmatch your ship somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2, right? You have one turret for every 2 turrets your opposition has, or even 1 to 3 is not remotely unheard of with these designs, right? So your ship is actually in a bad situation when you go against an equally budgeted ship, for the lack of a better term. While other factors are a thing, the amount of effective gunfire you bring to a fight is one of the main determining factor on how a battle is won or lost. You got the River Plate, Bismarck's little journey in World War II, von Spee's dance in World War I down in South America-ish, and then later the Falklands. Actually, that's a great example of a specific squadron of ships that had the superior firepower in the first battle and dumpstered the British, and then on the second battle, the British brought a bunch of ships back in and had the tables reversed, so even though he had the same ship, von Spee got destroyed in reverse. This is actually more of a case of range advantage, but the concept still stands. How many effective guns do you have in a fight? And because it's going to be brought up, some people believe in the concept, surprisingly a lot of people believe in the concept of a ship tanking an enemy formation that is kind of going hey diddle diddle straight down the middle and having all of its turrets firing in all different directions, engaging multiple targets at once. Once again, if the enemy has the same budget as you, they now have 5 ships or whatever amount of ships shooting at one ship. You're not going to last long. It's not a thing. And if you can go into the middle of an enemy formation and tank it for an extended period of time while dishing out punishment, you have a Mary Sue ship, and you're overpowered, so who cares about design at that point? Okay, how do you build a non-Gunbrock ship? How do you build a non-gun brick ship? Understand your ship, and understand the strengths, and don't overcompensate for the weaknesses, because that generally saps your strengths. That doesn't mean ignore your weaknesses. Real ships have budgets, so when you concentrate in one area, you're obviously going to be weaker in another area. Also note, most ships have a strong side and a weak side. By design, and this is generally by design, your weak side might not even be that weak, but because you have a weaker side, that means you also have a stronger side. The most basic concept of this is ships that have a lot of thrusters at the rear, and less braking thrusters, and generally even less side-to-side thrusters. So your ship has a very good nose authority, right? Very good acceleration, weaker deceleration. Means your ship is strong in the attacking route, somewhat. So you want to maximize your ship around your desired objective. What do I mean by this? So let's take a battleship, right? Because this one's the easiest to understand. Battleships are designed around shooting, other battleships and cruisers to a degree. They're not dogfighters. They don't get into spin battles. They want to just go to town, kind of like artillery. Contrary to what people believe, battleships generally don't want to go, into the middle of battle. They want to just kind of blast away. So, battleships are designed around maximizing the amount of main battery fire on your target at a given time. They're allowed to kind of position the way they want. Right? That's obviously not always going to be the case, but that should be your main design goal with a battleship, unless you're obviously designing a different style of battleship. The Viminal class is a good example of maximizing around a strength. So the Viminal is actually a destroyer in our universe, but it's a very good example of a ship that was built for a purpose. It's a offensive destroyer. When you look at it here, it's actually it has a bunch of missile launchers, but they're all designed, even though they're scattered throughout the frame, they're all designed to shoot forward because it's an offensive destroyer. And this gives it a devastating offensive attack when it's pushing towards an objective, right? But this weakens it in other aspects, right? Because it can't, in a turn battle, half of its turrets or even more are offline or not unable to shoot, right? It's obviously not attacking multiple enemies simultaneously. But this ship was designed to fill a niche, and most ships are designed to fill a niche. And this actually did what the CDF faction in this universe, right? They're one of our PvP factions. It did what the other destroyers in this faction could not do, right? It filled a niche. Similarly with the Eternity, that's the main ship of this series. It's a very large battleship. Actually, some will notice it's incredibly large. But it's actually only about 20% more in the fire department. It's just a series ship, thus it has a ludicrously large hangar, thus being so large. But this ship is designed around its main battery or capital ship weaponry, as I alluded to earlier with battleships. If you look at her from her broadside on, anywhere from the front, you'll notice she can actually unleash a 20-gun slaved broadside. That is, 20 barrels are pointing at your target. This is her strength and what she's designed around, unleashing a huge amount of capital-grade weaponry designed to kill emplacements or other battleships. Even most gunbricks can actually handle doing a pretty sizable broadside, but this is all of her main battery weapons can be used in the broadside. So she's incredibly efficient with her usage of her heavy weapons. It's actually somewhere in the neighborhood of a 330-degree firing arc, minus the behind area, basically. The only exception to this, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, once targets get to about 2,000 meters, which is somewhat closer range in our PvP environment, the turrets can't actually depress enough to cause both turrets to overlap, so you generally have to choose only one set of turrets when they get within 2,000 meters. This is considered close quarter range, and ironically 2,000 meters, or ironically, probably by design, 2,000 meters is where the secondary guns on the Eternity can open up. The reason why she's able to accomplish this is she has very elevated gun positions, relatively speaking, being basically a giant oval, and the guns are placed in the top of these ovaled positions. The turrets are also super firing, right? And most people know what super firing turrets are, but this is a concept when you place turrets basically in a staggered fashion above each other. The Eternity has a lot of these in a staggered fashion, allowing for 5 turrets to basically fire directly forward. So she can actually fire near directly forward. This allows her to have a very wide firing arc, thus allowing her to basically stay on the move while firing her entire main battery. I've said the word main battery a lot. World War II ships, generally for balance, and I mean like literal balance, like tipping over, although I guess the Washington Treaty was kind of like a balance patch, generally place about 2/3 of their firepower in the forward position and 1/3 to the rear. This still gives a good broadside, but allows options to shoot rearward in a fleeing battle or a turn, right? Evading torpedoes, for example, and still have most of their firepower available in a chasing battle. And those happen surprisingly often. Because we are in space, there's actually one more axis to consider. Because, some people might be thinking, wait, why not just put all the guns on the roof or, the dorsal side, right? You just tilt your ship slightly and you can bring all guns to bear. And this is theoretically the most efficient use of a gun system, right? All guns can fire in the broadside. That's because PvP is not a perfect scenario. Like I said, you don't want to, play around your weaknesses too much, but it's okay to do some designing around it. For example, in the Eternity's case, and to a lesser degree, the other battleship in the series, the Ravager, most of the guns, or in the Eternity's case, all of the guns can fire in the broadside. However, you'll notice that some of them are on the bottom. This allows, by design, some flexibility when you get swarmed by destroyers, you're in a turn battle, you're fleeing, you're going forward, advancing, right, as mentioned. You're doing a flip, essentially, right? This is space. We got 3 dimensions. All of this is having turrets in this position allows more flexibilities in these scenarios. And because you're fighting other human beings, you will be put in very many different scenarios, right? So this is maximizing surface area for maximum firing arcs in unconventional scenarios, and it's still designed such that it can use its, full broadside in most of these scenarios, or at least half of them, right? Which is still better than a gun brick, actually. The astute of you will notice the Eternity can't actually shoot backwards. This is mainly because she's designed after a Halo ship, and not necessarily because that was the design criteria. She's also designed to be balanced, right? She's the strongest ship in the series by design. We need to give her some balances so it's fun to fight her. A different capital ship design would be something like the Palatine-class heavy cruiser that the CDF have made, and this ship sacrifices having a more versatile broadside, right, like the Eternity or ships of that type with a very ovally shape. And much like the Viminal-class destroyer, it uses super firing secondaries and primary weapons in conjunction such that it has a very aggressive forward broadside, and it can still use about a third of its turrets in the side positions. The result of this is you get a very good offensive vessel that can quasi-dogfight, that is, kind of move in close quarters with other ships, and still keep a lot of its turrets available. That being said, because of the nature of having turrets surrounding the ship instead of localized in 2 or 1 areas, the broadside quickly degrades in terms of available guns if you go in any other direction other than the forward direction. But this is a viable option, right? Going on to secondary gun placement is a little less nuanced and more of a give and take, right? It's also about being creative. This is showing a couple examples here. The more armored and protected your turret is, the more of it will survive, but it means less firing arc and the more secondary guns you need. You also tend to shoot yourself a lot if you have heavily armored secondary guns. However, the more exposed your gun is, the more it can shoot, but the less armored it is, and these less armored turrets tend to die to splash damage. Here are some examples from different ships in the series. Alright, so that was a bit rambly. Okay, a lot of bit rambly, but let's wrap this up so we have a clear and concise points. Design around your ships, what their strengths and weaknesses are. Play to your strengths, design around your strengths, and don't overcompensate for weaknesses. You can compensate for them, but don't go all out on them, because then you'll just shift your strengths and your weaknesses around, and that's generally not great ship design. Not only design your ships around your weapon, that is, make the structure of the ship support what your weapon's mission set is, but also design your weapons to do the primary mission set of your ship. Right? A lot of people start with a good design, right? Like a battleship designed to kill other battleships, but then they overcompensate, for example, when, I don't kill destroyers as well, or I don't kill fighters as well, and they kind of slap on, way too many turrets and start clogging fire lines, and suddenly your battleship doesn't do the battleship thing so well. Conversely, does your destroyer really need to be able to inflict damage to a battleship? No, design your destroyer to do destroyer things. Furthermore, design your ship to engage one target. Right? You can have your secondaries go shooting other things, but your main weapon system should only be designed around shooting one target. PvP generally ends up as a bunch of 1v1 battles. The only time you should be shooting more than one ship is when you're in a really bad spot, and designing your ship around being in really bad spots is weird planning, to say the least. So, design around engaging a single vessel. Even in team fights with, 4v4 or whatever, ships generally are engaging one target, and that ship is engaging one target, so on and so forth. Furthermore, if you have redundant turrets, like let's just say you have a turret on the port side and a turret on the starboard side, perhaps look to minimize that by moving both of those turrets to the top. You have suddenly doubled your firepower, right? You've lost a little bit of firing arc, but in most positions, you can now bring 2 turrets to bear instead of only 1. Superposition your turrets. Super easy trick to maximize your firepower both forward and on the broadside. Okay, that's been about it. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe. I not only make more of these quote-unquote balanced design videos, and I've already made a couple of them, but I also have a PvP series that is the equivalent of a board game meets Let's Play meets like a giant universe thing. I don't know. Go watch the videos. I also have other videos coming like brawling versus volley fire, how effective it is in SE versus the real world, how it does in our sandbox, cruiser tactics, battleship tactics, how to siege a static position. We've done a lot of that recently. All of this been tempered by a lot of PvP battles against opponents that really hate losing, so it has some pretty cool stuff we've learned. Anyway, that's been enough for me. We'll see you guys around.